Imagine you're standing at, I don't know, 14,000 feet in the freezing Himalayan air. It's the dead of night.
Which is already a nightmare scenario just physically.
Oh, absolutely. But it gets worse.
Yeah.
You've got two of the most powerful nuclear-armed militaries on the planet clashing in this narrow, rocky river valley.
Right.
But instead of, modern assault rifles or precision-guided munitions, these soldiers are fighting hand-to-hand with iron rods wrapped in barbed wire.
It's visceral.
It sounds completely primitive, right?
Oh.
Like a scene ripped straight out of the Middle Ages.
Yeah.
But what if I told you that those barbed wire clubs represent the most calculated, mathematically precise, and, well, sophisticated military doctrine of the 21st century?
It is a really profound paradox, honestly. I mean, we naturally associate modern warfare with the absolute highest tier of technology, right? Stealth jets, satellite surveillance, cyber attacks.
Yeah, the shiny stuff.
Exactly.
Oh.
So when we see a medieval melee on a modern border, our instinct is to just assume a complete breakdown in command, like a regression to savagery.
Right, like somebody just lost their temper.
But the reality is actually far more chilling. That reversion to primitive weaponry is, it's a highly controlled maneuver. It's specifically designed to exploit the exact legal and diplomatic rules of the modern world order.
And that perfectly sets the stage for what we are unpacking today. Welcome to today's deep dive. We are jumping into an incredibly dense, genuinely provocative document titled India's Strategic Reckoning.
It really is a masterclass in, well, reading between the lines of global conflict.
It is. And the source for this is a remarkably candid, really exhaustive conversation between two fascinating figures. On one side, you have Colonel Satyajit Ghoshal, and he's a scholar practitioner. He holds a PhD in international relations, but he also has 27 years of hard-won experience in the Indian Army.
Right. He's not just an academic.
Exactly. He has commanded troops directly on the line of actual control of the LAC with China. He's run counterterrorism grids in Jammu and Kashmir. He led a United Nations mission in West Africa.
The value he brings to this whole analysis is that dual lens. He is someone who has literally stood in the freezing mud, responsible for the lives of his soldiers under immense geopolitical pressure.
Yeah.
And then he's taken that exact visceral experience and subjected it to rigorous, unsentimental academic scrutiny.
Exactly the kind of perspective you want.
Yeah.
And driving the conversation with him in this document is Sanchit Sharma. He's a strategic analyst and policy researcher from Jammu and Kashmir, and he brings this incredibly sharp, ground-level awareness to the geopolitical theory.
Yeah, the dynamic between them is fantastic.
So our mission for you today, as you listen to this, is to use this document as a shortcut. We want to help you understand the precise architectural shifts in how nations actually secure themselves today.
Because it's changing fast.
So fast. We are moving way past the daily news cycle to look at the invisible mechanics of border security, energy management, and institutional memory.
And I'll tell you, by the time we trace the through line of this analysis, your entire perspective on what constitutes a threat is going to fundamentally change.
Oh, totally.
You'll start to see that the most dangerous weapons an adversary deploys aren't always explosive. Sometimes they're bureaucratic or economic or psychological.
Now, before we plunge into the deep end here, I do need to put a very clear impartiality disclaimer on the table.
Very important, yeah.
The source material we are dissecting today touches on highly sensitive, politically charged topics. It references multiple government administrations, various political parties across the spectrum, both left-wing and right-wing, and some fairly controversial national policies.
Right.
Our objective here is absolutely not to endorse any political viewpoint, okay? We're not here to validate any party's manifesto or to take sides in domestic political debates. We're here purely to impartially report, analyze, and decode the strategic frameworks presented by Colonel Ghoshal and Sanchit Sharma.
We're just looking at the chessboard and the mechanics of the game completely objectively.
Precisely. We're breaking down the architecture.
And that neutrality is essential because the stakes of this discussion, they transcend election cycles. We are talking about the long-term structural survival of a nation-state in an increasingly hostile neighborhood.
Let's start with the biggest piece on that chessboard then, China. The document immediately takes aim at a fundamental flaw in how the strategic community even talks about Beijing.
Yeah, this was a great point.
Colonel Ghoshal argues that framing China as a future threat or some emerging challenge is a massive cognitive failure. China is not on the horizon. China has been standing in the room, rearranging the furniture for over a decade.
And he illustrates this beautifully by pointing to the concrete reality of infrastructure. Over the last 15 to 20 years, China has engaged in this unprecedented terraforming project in Tibet and eastern Ladakh.
Terraforming is a good word for it.
They didn't just build a few border outposts, right? They built an entire logistical ecosystem. And the critique here is that the Indian establishment essentially watched this ecosystem grow year by year, but chose whether through, I don't know, diplomatic optimism, hoping for a peaceful rise, or just sheer bureaucratic inertia not to match that development with the required urgency.
Let's put some specific numbers to that asymmetry, because the document gives a terrifyingly clear example from his time commanding on the LAC. He talks about China's Class 70, all-weather highways.
Yeah, that stood out to me.
Right, because for anyone not versed in military logistics, a Class 70 road isn't just a nicely paved street.
No, not at all.
It's a highly engineered highway capable of sustaining vehicles that weigh up to 70 tons. We're talking massive main battle tanks, heavy artillery transporters, continuous convoys of supply trucks.
And they can do this all year round, regardless of the brutal Himalayan winter.
Exactly. And because of this specific infrastructure, China can concentrate divisional-level combat power, which is a massive, overwhelming amount of troops and armor at any chosen point on the border within, like, 48 to 72 hours.
And then you contrast that with the Indian side of the equation. Ghoshal points out that historically, the Indian infrastructure constrained them to brigade-level concentrations.
Which are significantly smaller.
Much smaller formations, yeah. The Indian road network and the airlift capabilities, they simply couldn't handle moving larger divisional-level formations at that kind of speed through those specific mountain passes. It's basically a problem of physics and geography that China solved with concrete, while India lagged behind.
But the twist here is that Ghoshal says this physical asymmetry isn't actually China's primary weapon.
Right.
He introduces this concept of the comprehensive pressure architecture, and specifically a hyphenation strategy.
This is crucial to understand.
It really is. The core goal of Beijing isn't necessarily to cross the border and defeat the Indian army in a glorious, decisive battle. Their goal is far more insidious. It's to keep India perpetually occupied and exhausted.
Think about the geopolitical bandwidth of a nation as a finite resource, like RAM on a computer.
Oh, that's a great analogy.
China's objective is to run so many background applications on India's strategic computer that the system can never focus its processing power on the main task, which would be challenging Chinese hegemony in Asia.
Okay, let's unpack this. It's basically like playing a multi-board chess game where your opponent keeps aggressively knocking over your pieces on the sideboards.
Exactly.
You have to constantly turn your head to pick up a pawn over in Nepal, or, defend a knight down in Sri Lanka, or manage a border skirmish in Ladakh. And because you're so distracted managing all these little localized fires, you can never look at the main board right in front of you.
That captures the mechanism perfectly. Beijing uses Pakistan as a perpetual security distraction on the Western Front. They use economic investments and diplomatic cover to pull India's traditional neighbors, Nepal, Bangladesh, the Maldives, Sri Lanka, away from New Delhi's sphere of influence.
Which forces India to constantly expend diplomatic energy just to maintain the status quo in its own backyard.
Right. Add in the massive supply chain dependencies where India relies on China for active pharmaceutical ingredients and critical electronics, and you have this incredible web of constraints.
This completely reframes how you have to look at the daily news. When you read about a minor diplomatic spat over a trade route or a temporary standoff between two patrols in a remote mountain pass, the temptation is to view it as an isolated, unfortunate event.
A glitch, basically.
Right. But Ghoshal is arguing that every single one of those isolated incidents is a feature, not a bug. They are interconnected microstressors designed to consume New Delhi's time and energy.
Which brings us right back to the Galwan Valley clash in June 2020, the incident with the barbed wire clubs.
Let's talk about that.
If we apply the lens of this comprehensive pressure architecture to it, the brutality of that night takes on a very specific, calculated logic regarding escalation thresholds.
Right, let's really break down that logic. Because if two nuclear powers are fighting, why use medieval weapons?
Well, both China and India operate under the ultimate shadow of nuclear deterrence, obviously. But they also operate in a highly surveilled, hyper-connected diplomatic environment.
Everything is watched.
Exactly. The Chinese strategic planners understand the tripwires of conventional war perfectly. If a Chinese soldier fires a single bullet from a modern assault rifle at an Indian soldier, it legally and practically crosses the threshold of armed conflict.
It triggers the alarm.
Yes, it triggers standard operating procedures for military escalation that Beijing fundamentally does not want to activate, because an uncontrolled conventional war completely derails their economic growth and their global narrative.
So they essentially found a loophole in the rules of war.
Precisely. They designed their tactical actions to stay strictly below the trigger point of conventional firearms. By arming their troops with improvised melee weapons, iron rods, clubs wrapped in barbed wire, they could inflict severe physical intimidation. They could assert dominance over disputed territory and even cause lethal damage, all while maintaining the absurd but technically accurate diplomatic fiction that not a single shot was fired.
So they were operating in the gray zone, applying maximum physical pressure without crossing the red line of war.
Exactly.
That is a terrifyingly cold, bureaucratic approach to violence. But the document also reveals a critical failure in that very plan. 20 Indian soldiers died that night, and an undisclosed number of Chinese soldiers died as well.
Right.
And Ghoshal points out that these deaths actually represented a massive failure of the Chinese script.
Yes, his professional assessment is that the mass casualty event was a lapse of discipline at the local command level.
Okay, how so?
The higher-ups in Beijing scripted an aggressive, intimidating push to force the Indian troops to back down and cede territory. They wanted the territorial gain and the psychological dominance. They did not want a bloodbath.
Because killing 20 Indian soldiers ignited an absolute firestorm. It created massive international scrutiny. It sparked furious domestic outrage within India, and it permanently hardened the bilateral antagonism.
It ruined the plan.
Exactly. It completely shattered the quiet, managed distraction strategy Beijing was trying to execute.
Yeah.
It woke India up in a way that mere posturing wouldn't have.
Exactly. The local commanders let the tactical temperature boil over, ruining the strategic simmer that Beijing prefers. But, and this is key, this still leaves India with an incredibly difficult strategic puzzle.
Yeah.
If your adversary is willing to use lethal, improvised medieval weapons to stay below your response threshold, how on earth do you deter them?
Right, because if a platoon of foreign soldiers walks 2 kilometers into your territory, pitches a tent, and sits there without firing a weapon, you cannot legally or proportionally drop a bomb on them.
You're paralyzed by your own adherence to the rules of conventional escalation.
And Ghoshal notes that while India has certainly improved its physical posture since Galwan, rushing troops to the border, accelerating road construction, India is still fundamentally playing a reactive game.
They are reacting to the architecture China built, instead of building an architecture that forces China to react to them.
And a large part of that reactive posture stems from what he calls the intelligence-to-decision gap.
Right. This is a fascinating point.
Yeah, he says Galwan was not a failure of raw data gathering. Modern satellites are too good. The Chinese forces had been visibly building up their positions, gathering materials, altering the landscape for weeks. The imagery was there.
The failure was in the synthesis.
Exactly. The raw intelligence did not translate into actionable clarity for the specific decision makers who needed to authorize a preemptive or deterrent posture before the clash occurred.
It's the classic needle in a haystack problem, except you have a machine delivering 1 million needles a day to your desk and asking you which one is poisonous.
Great way to put it. So if China is playing this incredibly slow, long-term, multi-board game of geopolitical envelopment, we have to look at the biggest piece they're using to distract India, which is Pakistan.
Yes.
This brings us to a concept in the document that absolutely blew my mind. It reframes the entire China-Pakistan alliance.
You're referring to the concept of Pakistan as a live combat laboratory.
Yes. Because usually we think of the China-Pakistan relationship purely as an alliance of convenience, right? The enemy of my enemy is my friend. China wants to pressure India, so they fund and arm Pakistan. Simple.
That's the surface level reading, yeah.
But Colonel Ghoshal looks at the joint development of the JF-17 fighter jet, specifically during high-tension moments like Operation Sindoor, and he reveals a deeply functional, almost parasitic benefit for China's military-industrial complex.
To understand this, you really have to look at China's greatest strategic vulnerability. They have spent the last few decades building an extraordinarily massive, technologically advanced military-industrial complex. They are churning out stealth fighters, advanced radar systems, hypersonic missiles. But they have a fundamental glaring deficit.
Okay.
They have absolutely zero modern combat validation. The People's Liberation Army hasn't fought a major war since the 1979 conflict with Vietnam, which was largely a disastrous infantry slog that even Chinese historians admit was operationally highly flawed.
So for 45 years, China has been building this incredibly expensive, shiny military hardware, but they've only ever tested it in pristine laboratory conditions or in highly choreographed domestic training exercises where they control all the variables.
Exactly. They have no idea what happens when their jet goes up against an enemy that actively wants to shoot it down.
Right.
They need a crucible. They need high-intensity, real-world stress testing against a capable adversary with modern air defenses and sophisticated electronic warfare capabilities. And they need this data without actually going to war themselves.
Enter Pakistan.
Enter Pakistan.
This is where it gets so cynical. Every single time a Pakistani pilot flies a Chinese-designed JF-17 fighter jet toward the Indian border during a crisis, China is quietly sitting in the background with a vacuum, just sucking up pure golden data.
Let's explain what that data actually looks like, specifically in the realm of electronic warfare, or EW.
Please do.
Electronic warfare isn't about bullets. It's about controlling the invisible electromagnetic spectrum. Think of a fighter jet's radar like a flashlight in a pitch-black room.
Okay.
The jet turns on the flashlight to find the enemy, but the moment you turn on a flashlight, everyone else in the room can see exactly where you are.
Right, your radar signature gives you away.
So India's ground-based air defenses are watching that flashlight. They're analyzing its frequency, its pulse rate, its power. India then uses its own electronic warfare systems to try and blind that jet, essentially firing a massive blinding strobe light of radio waves back at the JF-17 so its radar gets confused and can't lock onto a target. That is jamming.
And while this invisible war of flashlights and strobe lights is happening, Chinese engineers are analyzing the telemetry.
Exactly.
They are watching how the Indian strobe light affects their flashlight. They're asking, did our radar software filter out the Indian jamming? Did our missile warning sensors detect the Indian tracking systems in time?
It is the ultimate outsourcing of existential risk. Pakistan provides the live firing range and the pilots who absorb the physical danger. China processes the telemetry to fix the bugs in their software, refine their combat doctrine, and improve their next generation of weapons, all without exposing a single Chinese soldier to harm.
And without suffering any diplomatic blowback at the United Nations.
Precisely.
And as the document points out, China then takes that refined jet, points to the fact that it survived an encounter with the Indian Air Force, and aggressively markets it globally.
It's brilliant.
They use Pakistani risk-taking to build a narrative of Chinese technological superiority for the global arms market. But it's entirely dependent on Pakistan's willingness to engage in conflict.
Which segues directly into the broader dynamic of how Pakistan engages with India, particularly through proxy warfare and terrorism.
Right.
For over 3 decades, Pakistan has utilized non-state actors as a deliberate instrument of state policy to bleed India. And they do this comfortably shielded by a concept known as the stability-instability paradox.
I really want to dig into this paradox because it explains so much of the frustration around events like the 2019 Balakot airstrikes.
It does.
When India launched airstrikes deep into Pakistani territory at Balakot, targeting a terrorist training camp, it was hailed domestically in India as a massive strategic paradigm shift. The narrative was that the old rules of restraint were dead.
Yeah, that was a public perception.
But Colonel Ghoshal is very cold water on this. He says the fundamental dynamic hasn't changed at all. Why?
To understand the failure of Balakot as a strategic deterrent, we have to explain the stability-instability paradox. Both India and Pakistan possess nuclear arsenals. At the highest possible level of conflict, a full-scale conventional war threatening the existence of the state, they have achieved mutual deterrence. Neither side will launch a massive, decisive invasion because it would trigger a nuclear exchange, resulting in mutually assured destruction.
Therefore, you have rock-solid stability at the top of the escalation ladder.
Makes sense. Nobody wants the world to end.
Right.
But the paradox is that this absolute, terrifying stability at the top creates immense, highly permissive space for instability at the bottom.
Wow.
The Pakistani military establishment calculates, and from their strategic perspective, quite rationally, that India is not going to escalate a localized terrorist attack in Kashmir or a subconventional provocation all the way up to a full-scale war that might trigger a nuclear holocaust.
So because the nuclear ceiling is so solid and immovable, Pakistan feels it has incredible freedom of action in the ambiguous space below that ceiling.
Precisely. They operate in this toxic middle ground. It's below the threshold of nuclear war, but above the threshold of what India can simply ignore.
And this is why Balakot, despite being a tactically impressive feat of flying and striking a target, failed strategically.
Yes. Ghoshal outlines that true deterrence requires three elements. It must be a credible threat, it must be clearly communicated, and crucially, it must produce consequences that the adversary actively wants to avoid.
So Balakot certainly communicated a willingness to escalate. It shattered the previous Indian norm of strategic restraint. But did it change Pakistan's calculus?
No. The infrastructure of proxy groups like Jaish-e-Mohammed largely remains intact. The infiltration attempts continue. If the adversary continues the behavior you were trying to stop, your deterrence has failed, regardless of how popular the strike was on domestic television.
Right. So Ghoshal argues that a genuine structural response to proxy warfare requires three pillars operating simultaneously. Let's walk through them, because this really clarifies what actual national security looks like versus just, military retaliation. Pillar 1, conventional punishment.
This is the baseline. It means having the military capability to impose rapid, severe, and undeniable physical costs on Pakistan's actual military infrastructure. Their command nodes, their logistics hubs, their airfields. And crucially, you have to be able to execute this at a speed so fast that the international community doesn't have time to intervene, call for a ceasefire, and freeze the conflict before you've inflicted the necessary damage.
Pillar 2, subconventional counterpressure.
This requires India to operate inside that same ambiguous gray zone space that Pakistan exploits. It absolutely does not mean resorting to terrorism, but it means using asymmetric, highly deniable means.
Like what?
Cyber operations, localized economic disruptions, exploiting internal fault lines, basically, to create equivalent strategic discomfort for the military headquarters in Rawalpindi. Make them feel the pain in the dark where they can't cry foul to the international community.
And then Pillar 3, which Ghoshal says is the most critical, yet the most underdeveloped in the Indian arsenal, economic and diplomatic isolation. And I want to pause here. At ELI 5, a term the document uses, the FATF gray list.
Ah, yes, the Financial Action Task Force.
For those who aren't familiar, the FATF is essentially the global watchdog for money laundering and terrorist financing. When they place a country on their gray list, it's not just a strongly worded letter of disapproval, it is an economic stranglehold.
Exactly. When a country is gray listed, global banks, the IMF, the World Bank, and foreign investors look at that nation as highly toxic. It means that if that country wants to issue sovereign bonds to raise money, the interest rates they have to pay are astronomical because the risk is deemed so high.
It chokes off foreign direct investment. It disrupts international trade letters of credit.
It essentially makes every single international financial transaction for that country more expensive and more difficult.
So Ghoshal argues that India needs to leverage this kind of institutional isolation relentlessly. You have to make the cumulative systemic daily cost of sponsoring proxy warfare so agonizingly high that it exceeds whatever perceived strategic benefit the Pakistani military thinks they're getting from it.
You need all three pillars working in concert. Currently, India has strong elements of the first pillar, limited application of the second, and struggles to maintain the third. Because maintaining international diplomatic pressure requires exhausting, sustained, unglamorous multilateral negotiations rather than the quick, emotionally satisfying hit of a kinetic military strike.
That makes a lot of sense. Now, speaking of the brutal physical realities of conflict, the document pivots from grand strategy to what fighting actually looks like on the line of actual control. And Ghoshal highlights a tactical maneuver that he views as brilliant, yet completely underappreciated by the general public: the deployment of the Rashtriya Rifles to eastern Ladakh.
This is a masterclass in understanding that human biology is a fundamental component of military strategy. The Rashtriya Rifles, or RR, is a specialized, hardened counterinsurgency force traditionally designed to operate in the valleys and lower mountains of Jammu and Kashmir.
Right.
Moving these specific units to the extreme, unforgiving high altitudes of eastern Ladakh following the Galwan clash is a deeply significant structural shift.
Let's really paint a picture of why this matters. If you or I, or even a highly trained marathon runner who lives at sea level, suddenly gets dropped off by a helicopter at Depsang or Daulat Beg Oldi, which are sitting at 15 to 16,000 feet above sea level, we're going to be instantly incapacitated.
Oh, absolutely.
The partial pressure of oxygen is so incredibly low that your brain literally starves. Your reaction time falls off a cliff. Your physical endurance vanishes. Just walking 50 yards feels like sprinting a mile.
It's brutal.
Your cognitive ability to make high-stakes life or death decisions under enemy fire is severely compromised.
It's called acute mountain sickness. And in severe cases, high-altitude pulmonary edema, where your lungs fill with fluid. It's not a matter of willpower or mental toughness. It is immutable human biology.
Right.
The human body demands a minimum of 2 to 3 weeks of gradual, staged acclimatization to function effectively at that altitude.
So imagine a crisis on the LAC erupts suddenly. The geography and the Chinese infrastructure we discussed earlier dictate that these crises will spark in a matter of days.
Yeah, we established they have the roads for it.
Right. So if the Indian Army has to rely on mobilizing reserve troops from the plains of Punjab or central India, flying them up to Ladakh, those troops cannot fight the day they land. They will need weeks just to adapt to the air.
And by the time they are physically capable of combat, the Chinese forces could have already achieved their operational objectives, seized the territory, and dug in.
But the Rashtriya Rifles units are already acclimatized. By rotating them and keeping them forward deployed in the high-altitude desert of Ladakh, the Army has essentially created a permanent reservoir of fully adapted, combat-ready infantry.
They can be pushed to the front line at a moment's notice, fully capable of sprinting, fighting, and thinking clearly at 15,000 feet.
It is a tacit, institutional acknowledgement that the traditional Indian doctrine, which assumed you would have weeks of warning time to slowly mobilize and acclimatize before a war started, is completely dead.
Exactly. The warning time for the next conflict will be measured in hours.
It's a brilliant adaptation.
Mm-hmm.
But as we pivot to the next major section, we have to ask a difficult question. Having troops whose lungs are acclimatized to the altitude is crucial, yes. But what happens when the minds of those troops, the collective institutional memory of how to actually fight and survive, is systematically erased? This brings us to the Agniveer manpower model.
This is undoubtedly one of the most controversial, sweeping reforms in the history of the Indian Armed Forces. And the document tackles it head-on, stripping away the political rhetoric to examine the raw operational physics of what this does to an infantry battalion.
Okay, I am going to play devil's advocate here and aggressively defend the government's rationale for Agniveer, because the financial math is terrifying.
Fair enough.
The Indian military's pension burden is an absolute monster. It consumes a massive percentage of the defense budget. Money that is going to pay retired soldiers cannot be spent on modernizing the force.
True.
It can't buy the drones, the cyber warfare capabilities, or the electronic warfare jammers we just talked about. We need that money for tech. Furthermore, the Agniveer model, which brings soldiers in for a 4-year tour of duty and then lets 75% of them go, guarantees a youthful, incredibly physically fit fighting force. Isn't a 22-year-old soldier with a state-of-the-art drone better than a 35-year-old soldier with an outdated rifle?
It's a compelling financial argument, and on a spreadsheet in the Ministry of Finance, it looks like a brilliant optimization of resources. But the flaw, and it's a fatal flaw, according to Ghoshal, is a fundamental misunderstanding of what actually generates combat effectiveness.
Oh.
Combat effectiveness is not simply an aggregate score of how many push-ups your soldiers can do or how new their equipment is. Combat effectiveness is rooted in collective institutional knowledge.
Explain how that works on the ground. Because to a civilian, 100 fit guys with guns sounds like a good army.
It's the difference between 100 talented musicians playing random notes and a symphony orchestra. It is the accumulated, highly specific understanding of how your platoon moves together, how you communicate under deafening artillery fire without speaking, how you read the terrain.
Right.
And where does that knowledge live? It doesn't live in the shiny new drones, and it certainly doesn't live in the training manuals. It lives in the human hard drives of the military. The non-commissioned officers, the NCOs, and the junior commissioned officers, the JCOs.
The veterans.
Right. It's the grizzled veteran sergeant who pulls a terrified new recruit by the collar and says, forget what you learned in boot camp. When the wind funnels through the specific valley at 3 a.m., the enemy always tries to flank from that exact ridgeline.
And here is where the math of Agniveer becomes horrifying for a military planner.
Yeah.
You have a 75% turnover every single 4 years.
It's massive.
It's like a tech company firing its entire engineering staff every 4 years and forcing a new batch of college interns to rewrite the company's core software from scratch over and over again. You are constantly flushing your operational memory down the drain.
Yeah. The 25% who are retained try to carry the knowledge forward, but the massive majority taking all that hard-won, bloody experience out the door creates a perpetual cycle of starting from zero.
It is the attrition of memory by design. And it's compounded by another deeply concerning factor. To accommodate this rapid, high-volume churn of a 4-year cycle, the military was forced to compress basic training. They reduced the training pipeline from 34 weeks down to 26 weeks.
And Ghoshal stresses this is not just a minor administrative optimization, it is a severe qualitative degradation of the product.
He points back to the Kargil War in 1999 to illustrate this. The Indian soldiers who assaulted and recaptured Tiger Hill did so in unimaginably brutal conditions, climbing near vertical ice walls under heavy machine gun fire.
Those soldiers were the product of a long, deeply immersive training pipeline that built not just physical stamina, but immense psychological resilience and unit cohesion over years.
Right, you cannot simply chop a quarter of the time off a training program and expect the human output to have the same psychological armor.
The cracks won't show up during a peacetime parade, but they will violently fracture in the first 3 hours of a high-intensity firefight. When you need a soldier to operate on deeply ingrained automatic instinct, rather than a soldier who is panicking, trying to consciously recall a rushed lesson from boot camp.
And beyond the tactical degradation, there is a massive, looming socioeconomic risk. What happens to the 75% who are let go?
Yeah, this is the elephant in the room.
You have tens of thousands of young men, highly physically fit, deeply proficient in the use of lethal weapons and small unit tactics, exiting the military every year. The government's stated hope is that state police forces, central armed police forces, and the corporate sector will eagerly absorb this disciplined workforce.
But the document points at the reality. Hope is not a policy. State police forces have their own deeply entrenched bureaucratic cultures, their own state-level political hiring quotas, their own specific exams.
If they choose not to absorb these Agniveers, you are suddenly injecting a massive rolling cohort of weapon-trained young men into a society with already precarious youth unemployment.
Men who served the state felt discarded by the state after 4 years and have limited economic prospects. The internal security implications of that dynamic are entirely predictable and, frankly, historically terrifying if you look at other nations that have struggled with demobilized unemployed veterans.
But the erosion of memory isn't just a crisis at the lowest ranks of the infantry. Ghoshal argues a parallel, perhaps even more insidious, institutional amnesia is happening at the highest echelons of military leadership. The Indian military is selectively forgetting its most brilliant, innovative minds.
This part of the deep dive was absolutely fascinating. We all know the statues of the famous generals, but Ghoshal highlights figures who broke the rules to win and how forgetting them hurts the modern army today.
Let's talk about General Sagat Singh.
Oh, yes.
He points specifically to General Sagat Singh during the pivotal 1971 war that led to the creation of Bangladesh. General Singh's corps had to cross the massive Meghna River to advance on Dhaka.
A daunting task.
Extremely. The Pakistani defenders had destroyed the bridges and set up heavy defensive lines on the opposite bank, fully expecting a slow, brutal, traditional amphibious river crossing that would cost thousands of lives.
So what does Sagat Singh do? He looks at the impossible geometry of the battlefield and he completely ignores conventional doctrine.
I love this.
He commandeers civilian helicopters, flimsy, unarmed, commercial-grade helicopters that were never meant for a combat assault. And over a series of incredibly daring nighttime operations, he airlifts his combat troops completely over and around the Pakistani defensive lines.
Bypassing them entirely.
And approaches Dhaka from a direction the enemy thought was physically impossible. It was a masterpiece of operational audacity and improvisation.
And here's the kicker. The detail that drives Ghoshal crazy. The Meghna River crossing by Sagat Singh is taught at the United States Army Command and General Staff College. The Americans use it as a premier textbook case study in how to execute operational innovation and vertical development.
But not in India.
Right. Within India's own professional military education institutions, it receives nowhere near that level of prominent structural focus.
And why? Because institutions are often threatened by rule breakers even when the rule breakers win. Military academies love to teach doctrine, procedure, and compliance. General Sagat Singh didn't follow the manual. He threw it out the window. By failing to canonize his audacity, the institution actively suppresses the development of future innovators.
I think this is profound. If you erase the guy who used civilian helicopters to bypass an army, you are sending a very clear, silent message to the 22-year-old lieutenant today. You are telling them, do not color outside the lines, do not risk your career on a crazy idea, follow the checklist.
You are, as Ghoshal puts it, erasing the imagination of possibility. If young officers don't know the astonishing feats their predecessors achieved through sheer creative rebellion, they don't believe they have institutional permission to be audacious themselves.
Who else does he mention?
He points to another glaring omission. Lieutenant General J.S. Aurora. Aurora was the commander of the Eastern Command in 1971. He is the man in the iconic photograph sitting at the table in Dhaka, physically signing the instrument of surrender, accepting the capitulation of 90,000 Pakistani troops.
It was the largest military surrender since the Second World War.
Yet his strategic brilliance is largely eclipsed in popular memory by Field Marshal Manekshaw.
Or look at General Harbaksh Singh during the 1965 war with Pakistan. At a moment of intense crisis, the Chief of Army Staff ordered General Harbaksh Singh to withdraw his forces and form a defensive line behind the Beas River.
A critical moment.
General Harbaksh Singh looked at the tactical reality on the ground, realized that a withdrawal would create a catastrophic vacuum in a rout, and flatly refused a direct order from the head of the army.
He staked his entire career, his reputation, and potentially his freedom on his professional judgment over his superior's panic.
And he was right. His refusal stabilized the front and saved Punjab.
It is the ultimate manifestation of moral courage. The willingness to defy a disastrous lawful order because your localized understanding of the battlefield is superior to the headquarters' distant apprehension.
Right.
If an institution forgets the legacy of Harbaksh Singh, it forgets how to teach moral courage. It breeds a culture of sycophants and yes-men, prioritizing compliance over tactical excellence.
So we're looking at a deeply concerning picture. You have a force where the ground-level institutional memory is being fleshed out every 4 years by Agniveer, and the high-level memory of rolled, imaginative leadership is being neglected by the academies.
Yeah, it's a squeeze from both sides.
How on earth do you rewire the minds of the frontline commanders?
Oh.
How do you prepare a junior officer today to face the invisible architectures and high-tech threats of tomorrow? This leads us into Section 4. The absolute necessity of foreign training and multi-domain exposure.
If the internal mechanisms of memory and innovation are stuttering, the only way to shock the system into modernity is through external exposure. And here, the document exposes a glaring structural vulnerability. The Indian Officer Corps suffers from a massive deficit of international operational exposure compared to its regional peers.
The comparison here was jarring. Ghoshal points out that an Egyptian officer, a Bangladeshi officer, or critically, a Pakistani officer, is routinely sent on extended professional training tenures abroad.
Right, they embed with militaries in Turkey, China, Saudi Arabia, the US, or the UK, and they do this in addition to their domestic training.
Now, why doesn't India do this at scale? It's not because India lacks money. Ghoshal suggests it's actually a byproduct of arrogance born from having a massive domestic infrastructure. The Indian Army has incredible, sprawling training institutions, like the infantry school at Maho.
Because they can train everyone domestically, they do.
Yeah.
It creates a false sense of self-sufficiency. It breeds an insular, we-know-best culture that actively discourages looking outward for new operational paradigms.
It creates a dangerous intellectual echo chamber. You are only ever learning from instructors who learned from the same institution 10 years prior.
Exactly. To shatter this insularity, Ghoshal proposes a specific, mandatory professional development framework. He says every single junior infantry officer must complete a structured 3-month international training tenure embedded with an advanced foreign military within their first 10 years of service.
And let's be crystal clear about what this means. This isn't a 3-month cultural exchange program where they drink tea and tour museums in Paris.
No, definitely not.
This is about embedding an Indian captain at the United States Army's Fort Moore during an intensive mechanized infantry exercise, or attaching them to the Israeli Defense Forces ground command during an urban warfare simulation.
The goal is institutional competitive intelligence. When that captain returns from Fort Moore, they aren't just bringing back a diploma, they are bringing back granular tactical assessments.
Like what?
Like how exactly does a U.S. platoon integrate a drone swarm into a breaching operation? How do they manage the electronic signatures of their radios to avoid being targeted by artillery? You cannot fully conceptualize multi-domain warfare by reading a PDF. You have to physically see it planned, rehearsed, and executed by militaries that are defining the cutting edge.
And there is no greater, more brutal classroom for the cutting edge of multi-domain warfare right now than the battlefields of Ukraine.
Oh, absolutely.
The document draws a massive, heavy line directly from this need for external exposure to the ongoing war in Eastern Europe. Ukraine is essentially a free, real-time, unimaginably violent masterclass in how conventional war will be fought for the next 2 decades. And Ghoshal outlines 3 specific emerging threats that redefine border security, which Indian officers must understand deeply.
Let's start with the first lesson from Ukraine. It's one that sounds incredibly mundane, almost boring, until you realize its lethal, paralyzing implications.
Yeah.
Battlefield energy management.
Yes. Batteries. Who would have thought the fate of nations would hinge on AA batteries and lithium-ion cells? But the logic is inescapable.
In Ukraine, the entire combat loop is extraordinarily electricity intensive. The secure radios, the GPS uplinks, the night vision goggles, the targeting tablets, the drones, the electronic jammers, the medical evacuation monitors. Literally every single piece of gear that gives a modern soldier an advantage requires constant power.
And in the early chaotic days of the war, entire Ukrainian units were effectively neutralized. They weren't destroyed by Russian artillery. They went completely dark because their batteries died, and they had no logistical plan to recharge them in the field.
Now take that exact vulnerability and teleport it to the line of actual control in eastern Ladakh. Imagine an Indian platoon engaged in a relentless 72-hour firefight. They are at 15,000 feet. The ambient temperature is minus 30 degrees Celsius.
Oh, wow. At those extreme sub-zero temperatures, battery chemistry degrades precipitously.
Yeah, a battery that lasts 10 hours at room temperature might last 45 minutes at minus 30. Diesel generators freeze solid. The fuel to run those generators has to be hauled up sheer mountain faces under enemy observation.
Has the Indian military calculated the precise battlefield energy requirement for a 3-day fight in those conditions? If your power dies, your secure comms die. If your comms die, you cannot call for artillery support or medical evacuation. You are blind, deaf, and isolated.
Power generation and management is no longer a logistics afterthought for the quartermaster. It is as mission critical as having bullets in the magazine.
That reframes the entire concept of readiness. The most valuable soldier on the mountain might not be the sniper. It might be the logistics officer who figures out how to string together solar blankets and thermal battery packs to keep the radios alive at minus 30.
Exactly. Which brings us to the second massive lesson from Ukraine: drone swarms and the mathematics of supply chains.
Ukraine has fundamentally altered the paradigm of aerial warfare. It is shown that the consumption rate of cheap, commercially available first-person view, or FPV, drones is absolutely astronomical.
We are talking about militaries consuming tens of thousands of drones every single month. These aren't multi-million-dollar Reaper drones that fly home after a mission.
No, these are loitering munitions. They're single-use. Every mission ends with the drone exploding on a target, getting fried by an electronic warfare jammer, or crashing because its battery died.
So the question for Indian military planners isn't a simple binary of, do we have drones in the inventory?
Right.
The real question is a horrifying math problem. Do we possess a domestic manufacturing doctrine and a supply chain capable of producing, programming, shipping, and delivering 10,000 new drones to the front line every single week, continuously, across a 3,500-kilometer border during a multi-month conflict?
And critically, do you have the institutional pipeline to constantly train the thousands of specialized operators required to fly them, knowing that those operators will suffer heavy casualties?
Which brings us inexorably to the third lesson from Ukraine: force regeneration. Ukraine has illuminated the brutal, inescapable mathematics of modern, high-intensity conventional war. The rate at which highly trained soldiers are killed, severely wounded, or psychologically shattered by constant drone surveillance and artillery fire is far higher than any Western military planner predicted a decade ago.
And this ties directly back to our debate about the Agniveer model. This is where the whole structure threatens to collapse.
Exactly.
If high-intensity warfare chews through your frontline combat troops at an astonishingly rapid rate, your nation's survival depends entirely on your ability to train, equip, and deploy high-quality replacements fast. But as we discussed, the Agniveer model deliberately compressed the training pipeline and hollowed out the deep bench of experienced NCOs who normally train those replacements.
You cannot simultaneously weaken your institutional training depth in peacetime and claim to be prepared for a conflict that demands rapid, massive, high-quality force regeneration. The math simply does not work.
It is a fatal contradiction in strategic planning. But And this is the crucial pivot of the entire document to execute the kind of massive logistical overhauls, the budget reallocations for drone factories, and the dismantling of flawed manpower models. A military requires a highly stable, deeply objective, and mature political structure supporting it.
It needs a political shield, so it can tell hard truths without fear.
And that brings us to the final and perhaps most sensitive section of our deep dive: parliamentary oversight and the depoliticization of the armed forces.
This is uncomfortable territory, but it is absolutely vital for the survival of a democracy. What happens to a military institution when its operational successes become campaign advertisements for the ruling political party?
We've seen this trend accelerating in India. The cross-border surgical strikes in 2016, the Balakut airstrikes in 2019, various border postures, these highly sensitive military operations are increasingly referenced in election rally speeches, printed on political posters, and used as proof of a specific government's muscular nationalism.
Colonel Ghoshal uses a stark, chilling phrase to describe this phenomenon: the weaponization of sacrifice. When the ruling party claims a military victory as exclusive proof of its own political strength, it doesn't just annoy the opposition, it fundamentally, structurally alters the institutional integrity of the armed forces.
Let's break down the exact mechanism of that corrosion, because to an average citizen, they might just see a billboard and think, well, the government is just proud of the army. What's the hidden danger in that?
The danger lies in the perverse incentive structure and the feedback loop it creates within the democratic system. If the military is publicly viewed and aggressively marketed as an extension of the ruling party's political fortunes, then the opposition party is suddenly, structurally incentivized to question, downplay, or even attack those military operations. Not because the opposition politicians are inherently anti-national or unpatriotic, but because the ruling party dragged the military out of its neutral sanctuary and threw it into the partisan political arena. It forces the opposition to treat the army's successes like the successes of a rival political candidate.
And that dynamic destroys the most sacred bond in a republic. The 22-year-old soldier freezing on the border in Ladakh isn't fighting for the BJP or the Congress or any political manifesto. That soldier is fighting for the Constitution and the people of India.
Right.
When their individual bravery or their ultimate sacrifice is slapped onto a campaign billboard to help a politician win a municipal election, that sacred soldier-citizen relationship is cheapened and corroded. It breeds cynicism within the ranks.
Look at how other mature democracies have learned to handle this exact temptation. The document points to the United Kingdom's model under Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher following the Falklands War in 1982. The British victory was immensely popular. The political temptation for Thatcher to wrap herself entirely in the military's glory to guarantee re-election was massive.
But she didn't.
But her government carefully, deliberately managed the messaging to ensure that the institutional credit for the victory went entirely to the professionalism of the British Armed Forces and to the commanders who executed it. Not exclusively to the Conservative Party. It wasn't about Thatcher being humble, it was calculated institutional wisdom.
She understood that over-politicizing the victory would ultimately entangle the military in partisan hatreds, weakening its moral authority over the long term.
Exactly. The document also highlights the Israeli model, which is even more structurally formalized. In Israel, before the IDF launches a major, strategically significant preemptive operation, the government is mandated to brief the Knesset's Defense Committee, which includes the leaders of the political opposition.
The opposition knows the intelligence and the rationale before the first bomb drops.
And that leads directly to Colonel Ghoshal's proposed architectural solution for India to stop this politicization. He suggests adapting a variation of the United States Gang of Eight oversight model.
Okay, let's detail exactly how this would work in the Indian context. The proposal is to create a legally mandated joint parliamentary committee consisting of roughly 12 to 15 top leaders from the political opposition. Right. The National Security Council, which includes the National Security Advisor, the Chief of Defense Staff, the head of the intelligence agencies like RAW, would be legally required to give this committee highly classified briefings every single quarter. They would brief the opposition on raw threat assessments, major multi-billion-dollar procurement decisions, and the strategic rationales for upcoming operations.
And crucially, the opposition leaders would have to sign legally binding, draconian confidentiality agreements, facing severe prosecution if they leak the intelligence.
Now, I have to push back here.
Yeah.
Hard. Because honestly, this sounds like a naive bureaucratic Band-Aid.
Let's hear it.
The Indian parliamentary environment is hyper-partisan, often incredibly vitriolic. Does simply putting politicians in a closed room and telling them a secret actually change the toxic political dynamic outside that room? Won't they just weaponize the briefings anyway?
It's a valid skepticism, but what's fascinating here is how this structure fundamentally rewires the political incentive matrix. Let's run a hypothetical scenario. Let's say the government needs to buy a massively expensive, controversial new air defense system.
Oh, eh?
Historically, the opposition would immediately scream corruption, call it a scam, and paralyze parliament. But under this model, the government brings the Gang of Eight into a secure vault. They show them the classified satellite imagery of Chinese missile deployments. They show them the exact technical capability gap the Indian Air Force has.
Right.
If an opposition leader is sitting in that room looking at the undeniable intelligence, they bear co-responsibility for the nation's security. They cannot walk out of that vault, go to the floor of parliament, and publicly attack the procurement as a frivolous political stunt without exposing their own blatant hypocrisy.
Because they know the truth. And more importantly, they know that the government knows they know the truth. It creates mutual assured destruction for lying.
Exactly. Or consider a preemptive military strike like Balakot. If the opposition is briefed on the raw intelligence of the terrorist camp beforehand, they cannot go on television a week later and claim the strike was just a fake operation designed to win a local state election.
It eliminates the precise information asymmetry that breeds politicization.
If everyone has access to the same baseline facts, you can absolutely argue about the execution of the policy, but you can no longer weaponize the intent of the military. It forces accountability on both the ruling party, who can't hide behind the military, and the opposition, who can't cynically attack it.
That is a profound structural shift. And speaking of massive structural accountability, the document briefly touches on theater commands. This is the monumental reorganization currently happening in the Indian military, attempting to get the Army, Navy, and Air Force, which historically operate in silos, to fight as a single integrated unit in a specific geographic theater.
It's the pursuit of jointness. But Ghoshal issues a severe warning here. Creating a theater command on paper is utterly useless, even dangerous, unless the appointed theater commander is granted absolute, legally codified, operational authority over the assets in his theater.
He compares this to the monumental Goldwater-Nichols Act passed in the U.S. in 1986. Let's ELI-5 this, because it's crucial. Before 1986, the U.S. military was a turf war nightmare. The Army chief, the Navy chief, the Air Force chief, they fought each other over budgets more fiercely than they fought the enemy.
Yeah, it's very disjointed.
If a commander in the field needed air support, he basically had to politely ask the Air Force to help out. The Goldwater-Nichols Act fundamentally changed the power dynamic. It legally stripped the individual service chiefs of their operational command. It took the steering wheel away from them.
The service chiefs became purely force providers. Their only job is to recruit, train, and equip the troops. But the actual power to command those troops in battle was given exclusively to the combatant commanders.
And the warning for India is that currently, there is a massive bureaucratic resistance to giving up that power. There is a very real danger of India creating theater commands where the new commander still has to negotiate with the single service headquarters in New Delhi to get anything done.
If a theater commander facing a Chinese incursion in the east has to pick up a phone and ask the Air Force chief for permission to use fighter jets located in his own theater, he doesn't have command. He just has a coordination role. And in the hyperfast, multi-domain warfare of the 21st century, coordination by committee is a guaranteed recipe for defeat. You need unified, absolute command.
Wow. We have covered an immense, staggering amount of ground today. We started by looking at China's comprehensive pressure architecture, the hyphenation strategy of using Pakistan and border neighbors as a multi-board chess game to perpetually distract India's strategic bandwidth.
We covered a lot, yeah.
We saw how Pakistan serves as a risk-free, live combat laboratory for Chinese weapons developers to test electronic warfare capabilities. We dug into the deep structural flaws of the Agniveer manpower model, exploring how it acts like a virus, deleting the military's operational source code every 4 years.
The institutional amnesia.
Right. We looked at the tragic institutional amnesia that forgets brilliant innovators like Sagat Singh and Harbaksh Singh. We explored why the brutal lessons of Ukraine, drone swarm logistics, and managing battery power at -30 degrees demand that Indian officers get mandatory foreign training exposure. And finally, we unpacked why establishing a Gang of Eight parliamentary oversight model is the only way to shield the military from the corrosive weaponization of domestic politics.
It is a vast matrix of challenges, and yet Colonel Ghoshal argues in his conclusion that all of these seemingly disparate issues, the infrastructure gaps, the disjointed training, the chaotic procurement battles, the politicization of strikes, they're not isolated failures. They are all symptoms of one singular, glaring root cause at the heart of the Indian state.
The fact that India does not have a formal, publicly articulated national security strategy.
Precisely. Look at the United States, the United Kingdom, Australia, Japan, and indeed China. They all publish formal, binding strategic documents. A national security strategy is not just a high-minded piece of academic paper. It is a rigid, decision-making architecture.
A blueprint.
Yes.
Yeah.
It is a document that tells the military, the diplomatic corps, the intelligence agencies, and critically the finance ministry exactly what the nation's core priorities are, what threats they are preparing for, over what specific time frame and with what allocated resources. It aligns the entire machinery of government toward a single purpose.
Because India lacks this unifying architecture, the entire national security apparatus operates on what Ghoshal terms strategic improvisation.
Mhm.
Every crisis is handled ad hoc. Every procurement is a new battle. Now, to be entirely fair to the history of India, for 75 years, the sheer willpower, the astonishing human brilliance, and the incredible physical bravery of the Indian armed forces have made that improvisation work.
Time and time again, the raw courage of the individual soldier or the localized brilliance of a commander on the ground has saved the day when the system failed them.
But the core thesis of India's strategic reckoning is that the era where sheer human willpower can overcome massive structural and technological deficits is rapidly coming to an end.
And that is the terrifying reality.
And that is the perfect provocative thought to leave you, the listener, with today. Think back to that image we painted at the very beginning of this deep dive. The soldiers fighting in the dark at 14,000 feet with improvised weapons. We are plunging headfirst into an era defined by artificial intelligence, by autonomous drone swarms that calculate targeting algorithms in milliseconds, by battlefield energy grids, and by the invisible strangulation of global supply chains.
It's a whole new world.
In that unforgiving, mathematically precise world, can a nation's security truly continue to rely on the heroic, improvised willpower of the individual soldier? Or does the future belong strictly to the cold, calculated architectures of strategy?
History suggests that a flawless architecture will eventually crush even the most brilliant improvisation. The only question remaining is whether the architecture is built in time.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into India's strategic reckoning. Keep questioning the headlines, look for the invisible architecture behind the news, and we'll see you next time.